Hello and welcome to this short video, which is number 8 in a series of 100 on 100 UK food law topics. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now you may be watching this video on our YouTube channel or indeed as part of our subscription-based online training website. If you're watching it on our online training website, then in addition to this video, you'll be able to download some extra materials, reference materials. You'll also be able to view 4 webinars, each about an hour long, going through this topic in a bit more detail. So what is the topic for this particular webinar? It's systems based on HACCP principles. What is HACCP is the first question I guess one has to ask. Well, HACCP is an acronym and it stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. It's basically a risk assessment and it is a requirement in food hygiene law to have in most food businesses above primary production such a system based on HACCP principles. Now, HACCP has been developed and established by the international body Codex Alimentarius. If you're not familiar with Codex Alimentarius, there is a separate webinar on the regulation of food law. But essentially, Codex Alimentarius is a group set up by and organised by the World Health Organization, the United Nations, which sets global standards for food, primarily to facilitate international trade. So Codex Alimentarius HACCP is or sometimes known as full-blown HACCP, is a fully established, internationally recognised risk assessment for food. But that's not the legal requirement in the UK. Businesses are not required to have a Codex Alimentarius HACCP. They're required to have a system based on HACCP principles. Before I run through the HACCP principles, just a few definitions. The first is a hazard. A hazard is potential to cause harm. The second is risk, is the probability of a hazard actually happening. We then have control measure, something that will prevent or eliminate a hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. And lastly, we have a critical control point, a step where control measure is essential for food safety. So with Codex Alimentarius, there are 7 principles. I'm going to run through the 7 Codex Alimentarius principles of HACCP. The first is to conduct a hazard analysis. Typically, when you're putting together a Codex Alimentarius HACCP system, it's normally used in sort of manufacturing and more complex operations. You will need to have a team of people who understand the business. And what they will do together is identify hazards, microbiological hazards or biological hazards generally, chemical hazards, physical hazards. They'll come up with a whole list of things that could occur to a food process. And then they will, through a process of evaluation, narrow that list of hazards down to significant hazards. In other words, hazards that are likely to occur, and if they do occur, may have food safety implications. So at the end of a hazard analysis, the food HACCP team will have identified this list of significant hazards. What they will do then is look at the process and they will identify critical control points. These are just define these really. So these are points that are critical to food safety during the food process. At each critical control point, the HACCP team will establish critical limits. These are sort of parameters of control. So things like, for example, it might be a temperature and time combination. It might be a pH value. It's something at a critical control point that controls the hazard. They will then establish monitoring procedures at the critical control points to make sure the critical limits are being achieved in practice. And if the critical limits are not being achieved through monitoring that's identified, some corrective actions need to be put in place. Corrective actions might include, stopping the process and throwing everything away, investigating why it went wrong in the first place, or putting things right. Once corrective actions have been achieved, then hopefully the production will resume to safety. The next principle is verification. There are lots of elements to this. The initial validation of the system. The system based on HACCP principles needs to be correct in science, so it has to have a valid reference point, but also you need to make sure that it works in practice. So there's an element of what they call verification. Typically, when you set up a new manufacturing process, you would do some dummy runs, checking temperatures and times and pressures and pH values and things throughout the process to make sure everything's behaving as it should be. That would be verification. Lastly, documentation. Documentation is commensurate, and in a Codex Alimentarius HACCP system can actually be quite onerous, because what you want to do is fully document initially the hazard analysis process, but also you want to make sure that all your critical limits are properly documented down. You want to make sure that all your critical control points are properly identified, and that there may well be record keeping necessary as part of your monitoring to demonstrate that monitoring's been achieved, and records of corrective actions and so forth. So it can be an awful lot of paperwork involved. The first steps of putting together a HACCP would typically involve these. So you put together a HACCP team. In a factory, you don't just want the boffins, the technical managers and the compliance managers. You want to make sure you get people who are actually doing the job. So people who are operating machinery, forklift truck drivers, people who are actually driving the lorries or sweeping the floors, cleaning the equipment. Those are the people who must have an input into a HACCP system, so that it is actually a system that is a real life system rather than just an academic process. What would typically happen is when you've got a team together, the first step is to describe the food and distribution. So describing the food typically involves things like shelf life. What sort of shelf life do you want to apply to it? How is it going to be distributed? Is it going to be direct to the final consumer? Is it going to go through an elongated food supply chain? Are we talking about a frozen product, a dry product? You need to describe the product, so then you can understand the safety implications of that product as you develop the HACCP. You need to describe intended use and customers. Is it a ready-to-eat food, for example? Is it being produced for elderly people as a food supplement, or is it aimed at young children, in other words, vulnerable groups? Then develop a flow diagram, starting at the beginning, going through the whole process, identifying each step in the process, and then verifying by getting out and walking through the process to verify that the process as you understand it is actually happening in practice. An initial step in HACCP production, or producing a HACCP system, is having regard to the prerequisite programs, PRPs. Prerequisite programs are normally set out in law, so you could use food hygiene law as a requirement. Things like pest control and temperature control, basic, training of staff, things like water quality. These are all prerequisite. The design layout of establishment is a prerequisite. In other words, you put all these basic hygiene requirements in place, and then you build your management system, your HACCP management system on top of that. So the HACCP in this particular diagram, you can see behind me, like the classical pyramid, you build your management system on top of your hygiene procedures. Remember, in terms of law, in the UK, Codex Alimentarius HACCP is not required. The law requires in Article 5 of Assimilated Regulation 852 that food business operators put in place, implement and maintain a permanent procedure or procedures based on the HACCP principles. If you look at Article 5, it then lists out pretty much the same sort of language as Codex, but remember, it is only based on those principles. There is no requirement, for example, for extensive documentation. Documentation will be commensurate with the activities and size of the business. A systems based on HACCP principle might be a pro forma. As you can see on the slide behind me, just about, the Food Standards Agency Safer Food Better Business is aimed at smaller businesses, caterers mainly, but also there are different versions for various retailers and so forth. But it's just a way of practically applying the principles of HACCP rather than using Codex HACCP itself. If you're a manufacturer, you might want to use the Food Standards Agency's My HACCP tool. I was actually involved in putting that together a few years ago, and it is available free of charge, but it's a more Codex-y type HACCP system. So it will take you online through putting and developing a more classic type HACCP. And I say that's more appropriate for manufacturers really, and perhaps larger caterers rather than your sort of small high street shops. Okay, so there we are. That's HACCP systems based on HACCP principles in a nutshell. That's just one out of 100 food videos on this sort of food law topics that I will be presenting. So please join me on the next one. Thank you for watching.